Our final talk of the community track before we hit lunch is from Jennifer Soble. Jennifer Soble is with the Illinois Prison Project. She is a criminal defense attorney and policy lawyer based in Chicago. I'm also in Chicago. What's up, Jennifer? Prior to starting the Illinois Prison Project, she was an assistant federal defender in the Northern District of Indiana, where she represented indigent clients charged with serious federal crimes and specialized in forensic issues, juveniles charged as adults, and sentencing law. That is some heavy, heavy work. She also served as senior legal counsel for the Justice Collaborative. Jennifer's a graduate of the University of Michigan as well as Yale Law. She is here today to share about the work that she's doing to empower justice in the Illinois prison system. Let me tell you, it is quite incredible. I had the opportunity to meet Jennifer last year in person, intermittent. It's great to see you again, Jennifer. And if I may, given the nature of your talk, I think you are going to unlock, pun intended, a lot of our minds and perspectives on an issue we may not know a whole lot about. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, making her way onto the virtual stage with the Illinois Prison Project, please welcome the noble Jennifer Soble. Take it away, Jennifer.
Thanks, Raj. Hi, everybody. I'm Jenny Soble, and I am the founder and executive director of the Illinois Prison Project. We're a pretty new nonprofit that helps people in Illinois who are serving unjust, unnecessary, or excessive prison sentences here in our Department of Corrections. So I'm supposed to talk to you about equity and justice for people who are serving outrageous prison sentences. And I'll be honest, I had no idea what I would say about equity justice in the context of intermittent. To me, my work advocating for people in prison feels really far removed from the corporate setting. And the outrageous way that our criminal legal system has been designed to and used to oppress Black and brown people really isn't news right now. So instead, I wanted to share some of my insights that my team and I have gained that might help you guys take on the work that feels big and difficult. In freeing 21 people who are serving outrageously long prison sentences this past year, we've honed in on three main principles that drive our success. We're trusting our instincts, we're embracing failure, and we're constantly willing to try something new. So I want to go back to 2012. I'm working as a visiting assistant professor at a law school here in Chicago. At this point, I'd been a public defender for about 5 years in Washington, D.C. I tried cases, like really serious cases before judges, before juries, murders, armed robberies, sexual assaults, gun cases. I really loved my clients and I loved the work. I was new enough at that point to lawyering that I had a lot of room to grow, for sure. But after 5 years as a trial attorney in one of the busiest courtrooms in the country, although I didn't think I'd seen it all necessarily, I thought I'd been near just about everything the criminal legal system had to offer. So for me, teaching in law school after being a public defender was sort of uninspiring. I was responsible for supervising law students who were handling juvenile cases. They were sad cases, they were hard cases, but there wasn't really anything really surprising or challenging or new. Nothing felt unfamiliar. And then one day, I got a letter from a client named Anthony. In his letter, Anthony explained to me that he had been sentenced to 97 years in prison. Now, Anthony hadn't killed anyone or even hurt anyone. He came into prison in 1998 on a 2-year stint for a parole violation. He was on parole for a theft case, and then he drove his car without a license. And back then, and even still today, that was enough to get you sent to prison. Anthony was mentally ill. He was mentally ill before he went into prison and remained so once he was there. He struggled with borderline personality disorder and some other underlying mental health conditions that made it really difficult for him to control his behavior under the best of circumstances. So he would act out sometimes, he would get upset. And rather than recognizing his reactions and his actions for what they were, like the symptoms of a very clear and diagnosed mental illness, rather than treating him like a person with a medical condition, the Department of Corrections put Anthony in solitary confinement. They left him there for 22 years. So solitary confinement, for folks who don't know, is torture. It's torture for anyone, even people without mental health conditions. Anthony was alone in his cell all day, every day. His cell was 7 foot by 12 foot, teeny tiny space. There weren't bars, there was a solid door. Food was given to him through what's called a chuck hole. It's a little slot in the door. At first, Anthony was held there for days, which turned into weeks, which turned into months, which turned into years and then decades. He pretty quickly got desperate and would do, as so many folks in solitary confinement, would do just about anything for human contact. One day he noticed that another person in solitary confinement was going to the nurse's station a lot and was getting a fair bit of attention, and he realized that that person was self-harming. And so Anthony started to self-harm. He cut himself to stop the mental anguish of solitary confinement, and just to create some other form of pain, but also because it came with this surprising upside, right? Basic human kindness. His small cuts would get him a trip to the nurse's station. His bigger cuts got him a trip to the hospital, where doctors and nurses not only treated his wounds, but they satisfied that really desperate and basic need for human kindness. Soon enough, Anthony was covered in scars, all up and down his arms, all over his body. He began swallowing razor blades. At one point, he even cut off a testicle. So the Illinois Department of Corrections didn't really like that Anthony was self-harming. They saw it as a liability, as opposed to a really desperate and obvious cry for help. So they responded to his conduct aggressively. Rather than taking him out of solitary confinement, sort of the obvious answer here, they kept him on suicide watch. So that's solitary confinement, but with the lights on 24 hours a day. That's solitary confinement, but in a completely empty cell with nothing to keep you warm or provide any kind of comfort. Sometimes they kept him in a straitjacket, and sometimes they stripped him naked. So when Anthony couldn't self-harm, he did the only other thing he could think to do to get some attention, some interaction, to get an officer to talk to him. He spat. He spat at correctional officers. He threw water at correctional officers. Sometimes he threw magic shade, which is the only other thing that people in solitary confinement are allowed at officers. Sometimes he threw water. Sometimes he even threw his own feces. Now, to be clear, he did these things while locked inside of a teeny tiny cell, completely alone and with nothing else. The officers that he threw water or urine or spat at were on the other side of a steel door. They had the keys, they had the guns, they had all of the power. Anthony's conduct was gross, sure, and it was definitely desperate, but it was never, ever dangerous, and it was a very clear cry for help. So here in Illinois, like a lot of places, it's a battery to touch somebody in a rude or insulting manner. And that's usually a misdemeanor that carries around 90 days in prison. But it becomes a felony when the person that is touched in a rude or insulting manner is a correctional officer. And so the Livingston County State's Attorney, where Anthony was in prison, that office began prosecuting Anthony. They prosecuted him for spitting at guards between 2000 and 2004. Now remember that Anthony spent 22 years in solitary confinement. So he was in solitary confinement throughout this entire period. And he was in solitary confinement every single time he spat on a correctional officer. But that didn't stop the Livingston County State's Attorney from the State's Attorney Office from prosecuting him. And they didn't just prosecute Anthony one time. They prosecuted him again and again and again. Altogether, they prosecuted Anthony 21 times. It's sort of shocking. It still shocks me, even though I know everything about these prosecutions. So Anthony, at this point, understandably, did not trust attorneys. I don't think I would have trusted an attorney either. And so he represented himself with pretty predictable results. He was prosecuted again and again, and then he was convicted again and again. And every time he was convicted, he got a sentence of between 4 and 14 years, additional years in prison for spitting. And the judge in that case, in all of these cases, stacked these sentences one sort of on top of another until he'd been sentenced to an additional 97 years in prison. So just for context, here in the United States, folks who were released from prison in 2016 served an average number of years of around 15, 16 years in prison for murder, right? Anthony got 97 years for spitting. When he wrote to us back in 2012, Anthony was serving a death sentence. So we received this letter at the clinic, and the professor that I was working with at the time was against us taking Anthony's case. This is now a decade after these prosecutions started, and at this point, dozens of other attorneys had represented Anthony. Attorneys had filed appellate briefs. They tried to take his case to the Illinois Supreme Court, to the United States Supreme Court, and really nothing had worked. And there was no reason, we thought, I guess, why I would succeed where so many other people had failed. But I just couldn't get Anthony's letter out of my head. 97 years in prison, a death sentence for spitting. It was inhumane. It was unjust. It was really unconscionable. And so I knew I would probably fail, but I had absolutely nothing to lose by trying. So I went to see Anthony at Pontiac Correctional Center, the most horrific prison you can possibly imagine. The correctional officers led me into the facility, and they put me on one side of a booth with very thick bulletproof glass. Anthony was wheeled around to the other side. He was in a straitjacket. His hands were sort of tied behind his back, and handcuffs for good measure. It was absolutely ridiculous. I asked the guard to take him out of the cuffs, to take him out of the straitjacket. I think I told him that he needed to sign something. But mostly I just wanted them to treat Anthony like a human being. It's really hard to describe that first meeting. Anthony was kind and funny. He was very charming. And he was really defiant in his own way. Our criminal legal system had treated him like an animal, worse than an animal, for decades. And he just refused to accept that. He refused to be anything other than fully human. In recent years, Anthony and I have talked a lot about that first meeting, and he swears that I promised that I would get him out of prison. Hearing that absolutely makes me cringe, because how on earth could I have promised him that? So although I don't think I promised that I would get him out, I know that I promised that I would try. And I did try, and it worked. With a team of lawyers from the law school where I was teaching, we successfully renegotiated Anthony's 17 sentences for aggravated battery, so that instead of stacking on top of one another, they sort of ran together. So why did I succeed where so many other people had failed? I succeeded because I looked at his case differently. You'll remember that Anthony represented himself at all of his trials, which meant that all of the attorneys up until that point who had worked on his case were appellate lawyers. When you're a hammer, everything is a nail. And when you're an appellate lawyer, everything is a legal brief. His appellate lawyers, who were talented, dedicated attorneys, went to court after court after court and spent a lot of time talking about how Anthony's sentence was cruel and unusual, how it was a violation of the Constitution, how it was a miscarriage of justice. Now, of course, I agree with them wholeheartedly, every step of the way. But as important as words like unconstitutional are, the reality is that these are technical legal arguments that don't actually win most cases. And Anthony's case was no exception. I'm not an appellate lawyer, I'm a trial lawyer, and I really hate writing briefs. So I started thinking less about these high-minded principles of justice and the Constitution, and more about just getting Anthony out. So I went back to the original sentencing orders. In most cases, people who are serving multiple sentences for similar crimes are allowed to serve them concurrently, meaning that they all happen at the same time. Here, the problem wasn't just that Anthony was convicted so many times. It was that the sentences were stacked on top of each other. So I poured over every single one of Anthony's cases, every single one of his sentences. And then I looked at Illinois' criminal code. I found a teeny tiny portion of the code that required Anthony's sentences to run together. It took almost a year to convince the state's attorney's office of their error, and then another couple of months to convince the court. But it worked. And Anthony came home from prison a couple of years ago. So here's Anthony at Franco's in Chicago, where we had lunch a couple of years ago. Since then, he's had a child, Anthony Jr., and he's inspired a bill that bans the use of prolonged solitary confinement here in Illinois. So helping Anthony was obviously the peak of my career at that point. But I'm an adrenaline junkie. And so winning an unwinnable case was definitely part of the appeal for me. And there was the undeniable thrill of doing something for someone that nobody else had been able to do. That was impossible, right? I righted a wrong that no one else was going to fix. I solved a problem that no one else was going to solve. But there was so much more to it than that. Obviously, right? Anthony's life had been restored. He had his life back. There are really no good words to describe what that meant to me. So Anthony's case for me was the really high point of an otherwise sort of dull year. Teaching was fine, but I still felt like as a lawyer, I had a lot to learn. I missed having my own clients. I missed being in a courtroom. And honestly, I missed fighting with the government, which I didn't really get to do while I was teaching. So I left academia and I became a public defender, a federal defender. Apparently, I can't sit still. So after about 4 years, I left that job to do some criminal justice policy work. For me, that was a really big mistake. Some people are great at policy work, and so much thanks to all of you out there if you're here. But for me, it was sort of boring, and it was a little bit too slow, and it felt like a million miles away from my clients, from the men and women and children who are caught up in our criminal justice, so-called justice system every day. But there was one real silver lining to that policy job that I had, and that led me to where I am today. Without clients of my own, I had time, like a lot of time, to think about our criminal legal system more fully. So one freezing day in January, like last January of 2019, I stumbled across the Illinois Department of Corrections website. I was sort of mindlessly clicking through their reports, their annual reports and their operational reports and their financial reports, when I came across this spreadsheet called prison population. Now, I wasn't really expecting much, right? But I opened it up and holy cow. It was a 40,000 line spreadsheet with information about every single person in Illinois' prison system. Their names, their date of births, their race, their sentence, what they were convicted of, whether they were a veteran, where they were convicted, everything. I was absolutely floored. And for weeks, I couldn't stop staring at this spreadsheet. I spent the next 3 days manipulating the data, and I found some really incredible patterns. Some aren't that surprising. Black people are dramatically overrepresented in our prison system, especially for cases coming out of Cook County, where Chicago is. But some were really surprising. For example, 1 in 5 people in Illinois' prison system are elderly. 1 in 5 people was taken into custody before their 25th birthday. Hundreds and hundreds of people were serving life sentences for crimes like armed robbery and drug cases. Now, there are some things you should know about the criminal justice system which help explain the patterns that I was seeing. And these are true at least here in Illinois. So here in Illinois, we don't have parole, which means that once a person is sentenced, that is sort of it. It doesn't matter if the person changes over the course of a 20, 30, 50-year sentence. It doesn't matter if the person becomes sick, if he finds Jesus, if he's now in a wheelchair. The sentence you receive is the sentence you serve. And at least back in 2019, there were no lawyers trying to help these people get out of prison, right? You could maybe find an attorney to look at your case if you had DNA evidence proving your innocence, or if you had the money, resources, and support to pay someone. But for the tens of thousands of people in Illinois' prison system who just didn't need to be there anymore, and let me be clear, that's almost all of them, there was just no hope. So weeks later, I'm still looking at this spreadsheet every single day. 40,000 human beings stuck in prison. How many of them were like Anthony, in prison because they were mentally ill and desperate for human interaction after decades of isolation? I knew a lot of them were elderly, but how many more were sick? How many had spent years growing up and changing, reforming while behind bars? How many never should have been in prison in the first place? I didn't know any of these men or women, not yet, but they haunted me. The sheer waste of human life, of potential, of kindness. So I knew I had to do something, right? I also knew I would probably fail. But just like when I took Anthony's case, I knew I had absolutely nothing to lose by trying. And I like a challenge, or so I told myself. And so I started a nonprofit. Now let me say, this is an absolutely crazy thing to do, and I do not recommend it. But I saw this huge gaping hole in legal services, and I just couldn't shy away from it. Absolutely no one was helping all of the people who were serving sentences that were just too long, sentences that were simply unjust, or sentences that were no longer necessary. I sort of looked around and nobody else was stepping up. And so the Illinois Prison Project was born. I started on the ground floor, like literally, that's not a metaphor. I started working on the ground floor of my house, which is where I am right now, in June of 2019, just over 1 year ago. After scouring that spreadsheet for months at this point, I realized that a lot of the incarcerated veterans in Illinois were elderly. So that's where I started, with elderly veterans who had already served at least 20 years of their sentence. I don't mind saying that the first couple of months were absolute hell. I was organizing files, figuring out who my clients were going to be, trying to communicate with them and build relationships, all completely on my own. I guess it's worth noting that at this point, I had lived in Chicago for 7 years, but I hadn't ever really practiced law here. I taught at the law school for 1 academic year, so like 9 months. And then I left to be a federal defender in Indiana, which is just a totally separate system with totally separate players. And I'm not a great networker, so there weren't bar associations or like lunch and learns or anything like that for me to lean on. I really didn't know anybody. I didn't know the other defense attorneys in the community. I didn't know anyone at the Department of Corrections, and I definitely didn't know anyone at the governor's office. So I had sort of nothing to work with, but I also had absolutely nothing to lose by trying, and so try I did. And after a couple of months, it started to work. So on a very long prison visit to a prison in downstate Illinois, I met Larry. He was one of 17 people I saw that day, which is a lot of prison visits in one day. The whole thing was a nightmare. But Larry, there was something special going on there. Like everyone else I saw, Larry was elderly. He was a veteran. But his case was different. He had been in prison at that point for 25 years for possessing cocaine. Cocaine was a drug case. It was a lot of cocaine, but still, he had another 30 years to serve when I met him. Larry was also in his 80s. He had dementia, he had glaucoma, he was starting to forget things. And I had that same feeling in my gut when I met Larry as I had when I met Anthony. This was inhumane. It was unjust. It was simply unconscionable. So I promised that I would do everything in my power to try to get him home. Let's see if I can do this time. 5 weeks later, I got him out of prison, and he was reunited with his family. And then in November, I got a little bit of funding, and the me became we at the Illinois Prison Project. That same month, we freed Lee Mosley. We freed Lee Mosley. And then Sherman Morissetti. Sherman is a Vietnam veteran who was serving a life sentence for an armed robbery that he committed in 1984. After that, it was Mr. Benaira, and then Basil Powell, Kenneth Cunningham, and Archie Cheney. These are all in March. After that, Marvin Bryan, Jerron Booker, and Frederick Brooks. About 3 weeks ago, we got the phone call from the governor's office freeing 7 of her clients, all of whom were serving natural life sentences for either armed robbery or drug cases. That's Charles King. That's David Abrams. And here's Michael Penny and Dwayne Dykes when one of my team members picked them up from prison at Menard Correctional Center. Earlier this week, Corey Knox came home. All in all, we freed 21 people from prison in 9 months. Almost every single one of them was serving a life or virtual life sentence. So I wanted to share with you a little bit about what I've taken away from Anthony's case and from what I've learned with my team in the last year. First, trust your instincts. That little voice inside your head, that's your voice. Listen to it. The next time that little voice in your head won't shut up, pay attention. Maybe there's a reason why you can't stop obsessing over that problem or that cause or that business idea. You owe it to yourself and to the rest of us to take yourself seriously. Next, don't feel failure. And I know this one is really, really hard. And it's really hard for me. But you, at least I believe you get one life. And so you might as well live it to the fullest. And I don't mean this to sound glib. And believe, Believe me when I say I really agonized over what launching this project would do to my finances, to my personal life, to my reputation in the legal community. But at the end of the day, I knew that if I didn't try to solve this massive problem in front of me, that I would regret it. And that a bunch of people I could have helped almost would certainly die in prison. So I gave myself a really little window of time to experiment. I came up with a plan B just in case it didn't work. And then I jumped in. Next, finally, be willing to try something new. So I think this is the hardest lesson to internalize, and the one that I have to remind myself and my team reminds ourselves of a lot. In the same way that a stranger is a friend you haven't met yet, your novel sort of out there approach to a problem might just be an approach that no one has thought of yet, right? When I started the Illinois Prison Project, no one saw a pathway for releasing a large number of incarcerated people in Illinois. But I saw a path. I saw something other people didn't see. Your idea might be great, even if nobody's thought of it yet. In fact, your idea might be great because nobody has thought of it yet. And if your idea isn't great, if it isn't even good, remember not to feel failure. Because just like me, you have nothing to lose by trying. Thanks.